I did not understand how terrifying that sentence was until much later, long after it stopped being a metaphor and became a fact that could no longer be ignored. Back then, it was simply my life, ordinary and predictable, wrapped in the quiet rituals of an old apartment and an old woman everyone called kind. My grandmother lived with me in a small apartment on the edge of the city, in a building that smelled of dust, boiled cabbage, and damp concrete. The elevator broke down more often than it worked, and the stairwell lights flickered like they were unsure whether to stay alive. She had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. Neighbors changed, generations passed, but she remained, small and neat, with her silver hair pinned carefully behind her ears and her cardigans always buttoned to the top. Every evening followed the same routine. She boiled water in a dented kettle that whistled too loudly, laid out 2 cups with faded flowers on them, and set a small plate of dry cookies between us. She drank her tea slowly, savoring each sip, watching me over the rim of her cup as if she were memorizing my face. "You rush too much," she would say softly. "Life punishes those who rush." I believed her. When you grow up hearing the same voice every day, it becomes truth. As a child, I thought all grandmothers were like this: calm, observant, unshakable. She knew when neighbors would argue, she when the weather would turn, she when someone would fall ill. People said she had a gift. She laughed and said it was just experience, that if you lived long enough, patterns revealed themselves. Sometimes police officers came to our building. They knocked on doors, they asked questions, they wrote things down in small notebooks. Someone had gone missing again. A homeless man who slept near the train tracks. A woman who cleaned offices at night. A quiet man from the next district who had no family. My grandmother always invited the officers inside. "You must be tired," she said. "Have some tea." They accepted. Everyone accepted her tea. It was impossible not to. They never stayed long. They thanked her, they apologized for the inconvenience, and left. Afterward, she washed the cups carefully, drying them with a towel she had used for decades. "They look so young," she once said, shaking her head. "Chasing shadows." At the time, I thought she meant the killer. I grew up hearing about him the way one hears about bad weather or distant wars. He was always there, somewhere beyond the edge of daily life. The news called him methodical, patient, invisible. He chose victims no one would look for too hard, people whose absence created barely a ripple. The city learned to live with it. I learned to live with my grandmother. She raised me after my parents died in an accident that no one liked to talk about. I remembered very little of them, only vague shapes and the sound of my mother's voice fading into silence. My grandmother became everything. She cooked, she taught me to read, she scolded me gently when I lied, and praised me when I told the truth. "Truth is important," she said, "but timing is more important." That sentence stayed with me. At night, I sometimes heard her walking through the apartment when I was sure she should have been asleep. Soft footsteps, a door opening, then closing. Once or twice, I heard her whispering, though I never caught the words. When I asked her about it, she smiled. "Old bones ache," she said. "Sleep runs away." I believed her. When I became a teenager, the killer became a legend. Online forums speculated endlessly. Amateur profilers argued about motives. Some claimed he was a vigilante, cleaning the streets of parasites. Others insisted he was a monster who killed for pleasure. One evening, while the news played quietly in the background, my grandmother listened more intently than usual. The reporter spoke about a pattern,
about how the killer seemed to appear where society failed. "Interesting," my grandmother murmured. I laughed nervously. "You sound like you admire him." She turned to me, her eyes sharp for a brief moment before softening again. "Admiration is a strong word," she said. "Understanding is closer." That was the first time I felt something cold settle in my chest.
Years passed. I moved away for a while, tried to build a life of my own, but something always pulled me back. When my grandmother fell ill, I returned without hesitation. She was smaller now, frailer, but her mind remained clear, her gaze steady. The killings slowed, then stopped. The police announced they had no leads. The case went cold. People relaxed. The city exhaled. My grandmother recovered. One afternoon, she asked me to help her clean the storage closet, a narrow space we had not touched in years. Dust coated everything. Old boxes sat stacked like forgotten coffins. "Take that one down," she said, pointing to a box on the top shelf. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, identical, plain covers, no labels. I opened one. It was not a diary. There were no dates, only descriptions. Names sometimes, sometimes not. Observations written with surgical precision. Habits, routines, weaknesses, reasons. He drinks too much. She lies easily. No one will miss him. She had her chance. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. "This is fiction," I whispered. "You write stories." My grandmother watched me quietly. "Do you like them?" she asked. I looked up at her. For the first time in my life, I saw her without the soft blur of familiarity. Her face was calm, expectant. "What is this?" I asked. She smiled, the same gentle smile that had comforted me as a child. "Order," she said. Someone has to keep it. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood there, holding the proof of something I could not yet fully name. "You taught me right from wrong," I said. "You told me killing was evil." She nodded. "It is," she said. "That is why I never enjoyed it." The room felt smaller, the air thicker. "They were hurting the world," she continued, "and the world did nothing. So I did." That night, I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the kettle, the cups, the place where she always sat. Every memory I had twisted, rearranged itself, revealing sharp edges I had never noticed. The next evening, she made tea as usual. "Sit," she said. I sat. She poured the water carefully, her hands steady. "You are wondering what to do," she said. "Everyone does, eventually." I looked at her and realized something worse than fear was taking root inside me. I was wondering if she was right. She noticed the change in me before I did. That was one of her talents, the way she could read shifts in people the way others read headlines. I began to move more carefully around her, choosing my words, watching my expressions, and she responded by becoming warmer, gentler, as if rewarding my silence. "You look tired," she said one evening, placing a cup of tea in front of me. "Thinking too much ages a person." I wanted to ask her how many years killing had added to her own life, how much time she had stolen from others and stitched onto herself, but the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. Fear was part of it, but not all. There was also curiosity, dark and persistent, gnawing at me whenever I tried to look away. After I found the notebooks, she did not hide them again. They stayed in the closet, exactly where they were, as if daring me to return. For days I avoided that corner of the apartment, yet every time I passed it, I felt its gravity pulling at me. The city outside continued its rhythm, indifferent to my private collapse. People hurried to work, argued in grocery stores, complained about the weather. Somewhere, lives went on uninterrupted because they had ended years earlier. One night, unable to stand the uncertainty, I opened another notebook. The writing was calm, almost tender in places. She described people the way a gardener might describe weeds, noting their growth, their spread, the damage they caused to surrounding life. There was no rage in the words, no gloating, only certainty. She did not write about methods. That struck me more than anything else. No blood, no violence, no indulgence in detail. Just preparation and aftermath, like check marks on a list. I closed the notebook and felt sick. "You will ruin your digestion if you read before bed," her voice said from behind me. I jumped. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her old robe, her hair neatly braided despite the late hour. "You were never good at hiding," she added. "Why keep them?" I asked. "Why write any of it down?" She considered this, and then shrugged. "Memory fades," she said. "Paper is honest." I swallowed. What if someone else finds them? She smiled. "Someone has." Her eyes rested on me, calm and unwavering. And for the first time, I understood that she had planned this moment too. Over the following weeks, she began to talk more openly, not confessing so much as explaining. She spoke while chopping vegetables, while folding laundry, while watering the plants on the windowsill. Her voice was the same one she had used to read me stories as a child. She told me how it began, decades ago, with a man who beat his wife and children and laughed when neighbors looked away. She waited. She watched. She learned his habits. When he disappeared, people said he had finally gone too far and fled. "No one asked where he went," she said. "They were relieved." She told me about others, a landlord who ruined families, a nurse who stole from dying patients, a man who hurt children and hid behind charity work. "I never chose randomly," she said. "That would be chaos." "Who decided they deserved it?" I asked quietly. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me. "I did," she said. "Just as others decide who deserves mercy." I wanted to argue, to scream that she was no better than them, but my voice failed me. Because beneath my horror, another realization had begun to form, one I hated myself for acknowledging. Some of the names she mentioned had appeared in old news articles, whispered scandals that never led to consequences. People I remembered hearing about, whose victims had been ignored, silenced, or blamed. She had not invented her targets. That knowledge poisoned something inside me. The police never returned. Years passed without another disappearance. The killer faded into myth, then into trivia, something discussed in documentaries and podcasts. My grandmother listened to these with mild amusement. "They will never understand," she said once. "They look for monsters. Monsters are convenient." "What are you then?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Necessary." Her health declined slowly. Age finally claimed what bullets and knives never had. I became her caretaker, helping her dress, reminding her to eat, listening as she drifted between clarity and memory. Sometimes, in the half-light of evening, she mistook me for someone else. "You came back," she murmured once.
gripping my hand with surprising strength.
I knew you would.
Who? I asked, my heart pounding. But she had already slipped back into sleep. As she weakened, I felt an unexpected fear take hold of me.
Not fear of her, but fear of what would happen when she was gone. The city would continue without her quiet corrections. The people she would have chosen next would go on living. That thought frightened me more than the truth ever had. I hated myself for it. On the night she died, there was no drama, no last confession. She simply did not wake up. Her face was peaceful, almost relieved. At the funeral, neighbors spoke of her kindness, her generosity, the way she always listened. I stood among them, numb, carrying a weight no one else could see. The police closed the case officially weeks later, citing lack of evidence and the passage of time. The killer was declared a mystery that would never be solved. I inherited the apartment and the notebooks. For a long time, I did nothing. I tried to forget, to bury the past, to convince myself that her death had ended everything. I went back to work, met friends, pretended to be normal. But once you have seen the structure beneath chaos, it is impossible to unsee it. I began to notice things, patterns, people who hurt others and were protected by indifference, stories that repeated themselves with different names. One evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in front of me, a notebook open at my elbow. I stared at the blank page. Her voice echoed in my memory. Order does not maintain itself. My hand hovered over the paper, trembling. I told myself I was only writing observations. That knowledge alone was harmless, that I was nothing like her. The first sentence came easily, and the first sentence did not feel like a crime. And that was the most disturbing part. I told myself I was only documenting, the way my grandmother once had, but without conclusions, without judgment, just facts and just patterns. I wrote about a man in our building who screamed at his wife through the walls at night and smiled politely in the elevator in the morning. I wrote about a coworker who enjoyed humiliating interns until they quit. I wrote about a shop owner who locked the door after closing and made young girls stay late under vague threats. I did not write that they deserved anything. I only wrote that they existed. At night, I dreamed of the apartment as it had been when I was a child, but something was always wrong. The walls breathed. The kettle screamed even when it was empty. And my grandmother sat at the table, her back to me, stirring tea that never cooled. When I tried to see her face, I woke up. I stopped watching the news. It felt too loud, too shallow. Reality was quieter, closer, and far more precise. Sometimes I caught myself listening the way she used to, not with sympathy, but with assessment. How often does he come home late? Who notices when she is gone? How long before anyone asks questions? The realization came slowly, like rot spreading under clean fabric. I was thinking the way she had taught me to think. The notebooks multiplied. I bought new ones, identical to hers, plain covers, no labels. I told myself it was coincidence, but I knew better. The ritual mattered. She had understood that. Repetition gave shape to intention. I kept them hidden, yet never locked away. Some part of me wanted to be discovered, to be stopped. Another part wanted to be recognized. One evening, while sorting through her old belongings, I found something I had missed before. A small box tucked behind winter coats, heavier than it looked. Inside were objects wrapped carefully in cloth. A watch, a ring, a key with no obvious lock. Trophies. I sat on the floor for a long time, unable to breathe.
Until then, I had clung to the illusion that she was different, that her violence had been abstract, almost theoretical. These objects shattered that lie. They were intimate, personal, taken from bodies that had once been warm. I understood then that the notebooks were not for memory. They were for permission. The city began to feel smaller. Every street corner, every familiar face carried weight. I wondered how many times she had stood where I stood, watched what I watched, felt this tightening certainty grow inside her. One night, the man from our building followed his wife into the stairwell. I heard shouting, then a dull sound, like something heavy striking concrete.
I froze in my apartment, heart pounding, waiting for sirens that never came. The next morning, she wore sunglasses indoors. She said she had fallen. I wrote 3 pages about them that night. I told myself I would give the notebooks to the police. I told myself this almost every day. Yet I always postponed it, waiting for the right moment, the right proof, the right justification. Deep down, I was waiting for something else. A sign. It came quietly, without drama. The shop owner was arrested after a girl finally spoke. The co-worker was promoted. The man from the building brought flowers home and laughed loudly in the hallway. Justice, I learned, was inconsistent, selective, lazy. My grandmother's voice returned to me with terrifying clarity. Order does not happen on its own. I started following one of them. Just once, I said, just to see if the pattern held. He took the same route every evening. He stopped at the same bar. He left alone. I did not touch him. I did not speak to him. I went home and vomited until my throat burned. But something had shifted. I had crossed from observation into proximity. The next time was easier. By the time I realized I was not afraid anymore, it was already too late. I stood in the kitchen one night, making tea the way she had taught me, measuring the leaves by instinct, waiting for the exact sound of the kettle before removing it from the heat. I set out 2 cups before remembering I was alone. For a moment, I felt disappointed. I began to understand why she never rushed. The city changed again, another disappearance, then another. The news used familiar language, methodical, careful, invisible. I stopped writing names. I no longer needed them. On the anniversary of my grandmother's death, I took one of the old notebooks and placed it back in the closet, exactly where I had found it. It felt important, like closing a circle. That night, I dreamed of her again. This time, she turned around, and she was smiling. The city did not notice the change at first. It never does. Disappearance is a quiet thing when the person vanishing has already been erased in smaller ways. Missed calls that no one returns, a job no one checks on, a family that learned long ago not to ask questions that lead nowhere. The city had trained itself to look away, and I learned to move within that blind spot as naturally as breathing. I told myself I was still choosing carefully, that I was correcting, not indulging, that every step I took was measured, restrained, necessary. These words came easily now, sliding into place with a familiarity that frightened me more than fear ever had. Fear would have meant resistance. Instead, there was clarity. I began to feel her presence in moments that had nothing to do with memory. When I stood too long in one place, waiting. When I listened instead of reacting. When I noticed how people exposed themselves without realizing it. She was not a voice anymore. She was a method. I understood then why she had lived so long. Not because she avoided danger, but because danger avoided her. The first time someone did not come back, I waited for guilt. I waited for panic, for regret, for the cracking sensation people talk about when they cross a moral boundary. None of it came. What came instead was silence. Deep, heavy, complete. The kind of silence you feel after a storm, when the air itself seems stunned. I scrubbed my hands until the skin burned, not because they felt dirty, but because I needed sensation, proof that something had happened. The water ran clear. My reflection in the mirror looked the same. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The city responded the way it always had. A short article. A concerned quote from someone who barely knew the missing person. A police spokesperson asking for information. Then nothing. No candlelight vigils, no outrage, no demands. I began to see the pattern not as my grandmother had described it, but as something larger, something structural. The city was not indifferent because it was cruel. It was indifferent because it was efficient. It conserved emotion for those who mattered. That knowledge hollowed something inside me. The notebooks changed. My handwriting became smaller, tighter. Observations turned into conclusions. Conclusions turned into certainty. I stopped writing after. Only before mattered. I stopped counting time. Weeks blurred. Months folded in on themselves. The city aged around me, buildings peeling, new faces replacing old ones, as if nothing fundamental had shifted. Sometimes I wondered how many others like me existed, unnoticed, operating under different justifications, convinced of their own necessity. The thought was comforting. One evening, a knock came at my door. I froze. No one knocked on my door anymore. Everyone texted. Everyone announced themselves in advance. Knocking belonged to another era, to urgency, to intrusion. For a moment, I considered not answering. Then I did. A police officer stood in the hallway, young, tired, polite. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "We're asking a few questions in the building." I nodded, stepping aside without thinking. "Please," I said. "Come in. Have some tea." The words left my mouth before I realized where they came from. He hesitated, then smiled apologetically. "I should not." "Just a minute," I said. "It's cold out there." He stepped inside. As the kettle heated, I felt something inside me settle into place, like a mechanism finally aligning. I watched him sit at the table, his posture tense but respectful, his eyes scanning the apartment the way all officers do when they pretend not to. "This place," he said, glancing around, "feels familiar."
Did your grandmother live here?
"Yes," I said. "She raised me." He nodded. "She was well known." The kettle screamed. I poured the water carefully, steady hands, precise movements. I placed the cup in front of him. He took a sip. For a brief, electric second, our eyes met, and I felt an absurd urge to warn him, to tell him to leave, to run. But he smiled. "Good tea," he said. We talked about nothing, about the building, about the weather, about how strange the city had become. He asked gentle questions, careful questions, the kind designed not to alarm. I answered truthfully. That was the trick. Truth, timed correctly, hides itself. Eventually, he stood, thanked me, and left. The door closed softly behind him. I leaned against it, breathing slowly, waiting for my heart to slow. It did not race. It beat evenly, calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. I understood then that I was no longer afraid of being caught. I was afraid of being interrupted. That realization terrified me. I considered stopping, truly stopping, destroying the notebooks, moving away, becoming someone else in a city that did not know me. But every version of that future felt wrong, incomplete, like abandoning a responsibility I had already accepted. Responsibility. That was the word she would have used. The next disappearance was different. This time, people noticed. The person had connections, a job people respected, a family that asked questions loudly and publicly. The news lingered. Social media speculated. Pressure built. For the first time in years, the city cared. I felt exposed. Police activity increased. Patrols multiplied. The blind spots shrank. I made mistakes. Small ones, but noticeable. A routine broken. A witness who remembered a face, though not clearly enough to be useful. I began to feel watched. At night, I dreamed of the kitchen again, but now the table was set for more than two. Cups stretched into the distance, each one steaming, each one waiting. My grandmother stood at the head of the table. "You were always too impatient," she said, not unkindly. "I tried," I said. She looked at me with something like pride. "That is why you will be caught," she replied, "and why it will not matter." I woke drenched in sweat. Days later, the knock came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I opened the door to find several officers. The young one from before stood among them, his expression unreadable. "We need you to come with us," he said gently. I nodded. As they led me down the stairwell, past neighbors who stared with open curiosity, I felt a strange lightness, relief almost, an ending, finally. In the interrogation room, they laid out their evidence, circumstantial, incomplete, suggestive but fragile. "You're not our main suspect," the young officer admitted, "but we think you know something." I smiled. "You're too late," I said. He frowned. "Late for what?" "For understanding," I replied. "They charged me anyway. Not for everything, just enough. The trial was long, public, hungry. The media needed a face, and I provided one. They called me many things: monster, copycat, product of abuse. They never mentioned my grandmother. She remained what she had always been, invisible. In the end, they convicted me of some of it, not all. The city exhaled again, satisfied. A shape had been given to its fear, a container. As they led me away, I thought of the notebooks still hidden, the patterns still visible to anyone willing to look. From my cell, I listen to the news sometimes. They speak of new disappearances, new theories, new mysteries. I smile into the dim light and think of tea cooling on a kitchen table somewhere, untouched, waiting. The city has not changed. It has simply passed the cup to someone else. I am writing this because they allow me paper. They believe writing is harmless, a way to confess, a way to process guilt. They still think in those terms. The young officer visited me once after the trial. He sat across from me, hands folded, eyes searching my face for something human. "Do you regret it?" he asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I regret stopping," I said. He flinched, just barely. They transferred me soon after. Different facility, different walls, same silence. Time behaves strangely here. Days stretch, nights fold inward. I have learned that routine survives anywhere, if you respect it. Every evening, at the same hour, I imagine the kettle. I imagine the sound it makes just before boiling, that exact moment when impatience ruins everything. I never rush it in my mind. I think about the city often, not with longing, with assessment. They blamed me because they needed to.
because one face is easier than a system, because monsters are comforting when they are singular. My grandmother understood that better than anyone. They never searched the apartment thoroughly. They never found all the notebooks. Some of them are still there, hidden where only someone who lived that life would think to look. Sometimes I imagine a new tenant finding them years from now. Someone curious, someone attentive, someone who has already noticed how many screams go unanswered. I wonder if they will recognize the handwriting. I wonder if they will add their own. At night, when the lights dim, I hear others whispering through the walls. Confessions, regrets, justifications. Everyone here believes they are different. I know better. The last time I dreamed of my grandmother, she did not speak. She sat at the table, pouring tea into cup after cup, never spilling a drop. When she finished, she looked up at me and nodded, as if a task had been completed correctly. I woke with the taste of tea in my mouth.
They say the killings will stop now. They say the pattern is broken. They say the city is safe. I smile when I hear this, because I know something they do not. The city does not create people like her. The city requires them, and it always finds a way to make another cup.